Hey, this is David Worth with the Keenan Flagler Business School at UNC. I'm here with Nathaniel Margulies, who's a recent graduate. Nathaniel, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, David.
I really want to get a good idea of what it's like to just have recently gotten your MBA and entered the workforce, because it's obviously a time full of uncertainty. A lot of jobs and internships have been kind of thrown out of whack, and people are having to adjust. So you were nice enough to say you'd kind of share your own experiences, and I hope somebody will hear what it's like and how you're feeling, and maybe it'll help them in their own lives. So how are you doing? Thanks for joining.
Yeah, I think I'll start by saying a little bit of looking around on this video is some explanation of how I'm doing. I think even the process of moving after business school to back to my job in Philadelphia was an adventure, where moving companies had restrictions because of coronavirus. Furniture is all back ordered because everybody is trying to get things for the home. So that's why artwork still isn't up yet. I'm still working off a dining table, don't quite have a desk yet, as that's back ordered. And I think I'm in a lot of ways, I feel lucky in that my career wasn't delayed or pushed or otherwise modified. So I think even with the general weirdness, I still would consider myself one of the lucky graduates.
Yeah, so you have like a bike over there, and they're like impossible to find right now, at least in Greensboro, North Carolina. So, you know, put a lock on that thing when you ride it around. So what types of things have you been doing to kind of stay sane, stay grounded while you've made this transition from business school, just to stay, keep yourself in a good, healthy position?
I think the first thing a lot of our friends realized was, a lot of my friends realized was that if we were going to do things as a group, and we couldn't do them in person anymore, finding ways to do them virtually or stay connected with friends virtually was going to be really important. Whether that's every week we're going to meet to play cards over Zoom, or every week we're going to watch a TV show together over Zoom, or whatever it might be. But finding a way to stay connected to friends was a really important one. Another one was just giving myself some sort of goal to work towards, even if it was small, even if it only lasted a week, and then you pick something else the next week of, I want to do this in the gym over this week, or I want to read this book. Just having something to feel like, okay, even though things aren't open outdoors, I can give myself kind of that same level of activity or mental stimulation working indoors towards something.
So, and obviously a pillar of the Family Enterprise Center is education. You participated in our family business classes last year. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience and why you decided to sign up for those classes and what they provided for you?
Yeah, I think I first decided to sign up for it after meeting a couple of the professors from the Family Enterprise Center, who I was extremely impressed with Cooper and Steve and that team. But also, when I thought about what my career was going to look like after leaving an MBA program, so many of the business leaders of today are people who are leading family businesses. Or if you look at the great, the Fortune 500 companies, so many of them have their roots as family businesses. And if I thought, how am I going to be successful working probably inside or alongside so many of those organizations over the course of a career, I better understand some of how they work, what are the kinds of problems they run into, how do they think through those problems, what research is there that tells you how those organizations typically succeed or fail. I thought that whole topic is somewhat agnostic of what industry or how big or how small, but the parts about what make them family businesses, the dynamics that come with being a family business, was something I wasn't going to get the opportunity to learn elsewhere.
So your background, you're not from a traditional like family business that had an owner who was your relative who had the intention of transferring it, for example, to the next generation.
No, I was not from a family business owning, or a business owning family, excuse me.
I got you. So what was your background and like what types of businesses were you exposed to when you were younger?
Yeah, so growing up, even though I wasn't from a business owning family, my dad did work for a family owned business, a liquor distributor in the Maryland and DC area. And he was a non family executive for that business and helped the family members figure out and navigate the business after a generational transfer where maybe the next generation wasn't as familiar with the ins and outs of that industry, which is a very regulated, really high barrier to entry business that the next generation just had never fully understood. So I got to watch him do a lot of that. And then after graduating from Washington University in St. Louis for my undergrad, I went to work for what is a family-owned business. It was a larger one, about 10,000 people in the software space, but it was still owned by a woman who founded the software company and ran it very much like a family business with those same kinds of concerns of how is succession planning going to operate? How do we deal with giving equity to the employees while still retaining family ownership? So I haven't been part of a business owning family, but for my entire life, I've been associated with or watching business owning families.
Yeah, I have a theory that when these like larger companies like a Google or like the FANGs, as they say, when people talk about culture and being and developing their culture, they're actually talking about trying to become more family in a way and duplicate somewhat of a family atmosphere, which involves kind of caring outside of purely like the next 3 months financial performance. And that it's a cool class to take for anybody because it's also a chance to kind of reflect on different aspects of business and the motivations people have for running a business and how you might like in the class we talk about you get to see different speakers, and I even when I'm in class understand that there's a saying, if you've seen one family business, you've seen one family business. And a lot of the industries and the business dynamics are the same, but there's a tone and a way they think about the business that's often different, and you can attract or kind of put people off just based on that cultural element. And it sounds like growing up, your dad and family had an experience that they were kind of a part of the business, almost in a family way.
Yeah, and I think when you start to see that level of trust where the family would look at my dad and say, we need you to make this decision on our behalf, and we're in a lot of ways trusting you with our livelihood and our legacy to make this right and to figure it out. And seeing his interplay with that was pretty integral for me, understanding how, even from a non-family executive or non-family employee point of view, these family businesses were not just looking at the people who worked for that organization as employees, but really as extensions of their livelihood, of their legacy, of their family name. It means something a little different. It's not quite a job to them.
I have some friends who are founders, and so family business is on the entrepreneurship spectrum because it starts with a founder or founders, and they don't even realize they're in family businesses yet. So oftentimes you kind of fall into it. There's this moment where you realize, like in the job you're doing now, where you're like, wait, I'm going to be interacting with a lot of family businesses. I might as well understand better these dynamics and what the decision making is like when one of the other family members wants to come into the business, the next generation is ready to get in the business, or the founder wants them in the business and the next generation wants nothing to do with it. And so there's financial and family components to kind of dealing with that. Did you have any, when you took the classes, did you have any kind of aha moments that you felt like you kind of stuck with you or made an impression?
Yes, absolutely. And I remember the day where Steve was actually talking about this in class, and I stuck around to talk about this with him for a while afterwards because it was so mind-blowing for me. But I think in my mind, because it was both in the example I saw growing up and implied in the word family that all family businesses have good communication because they're family. They go home, they sit at the dinner table, and they talk about it if there's a thing to talk about. And I think when Steve presented what was a very obvious point in retrospect, which is all families have dynamics. Every single family has them, and it makes those companies not immune from communication problems. And here are some examples of communication problems that can arise in family businesses and how to work through them. And just thinking, oh my gosh, I've had this wrong impression in my mind forever that family business problems can always just be worked out at the dinner table, no problem. And thinking through, okay, there have to be strategies to deal with these kinds of problems. How do families actually think about them or deal with them when it's not direct family, when it's cousins or second cousins, as the family grows. That day in particular was really big for me, realizing that, you know, family businesses have all those benefits that we talked about, but I think every family knows that it can be really hard sometimes to get along because of how close you all are, and recognizing that those are issues that you can run into when running a business, and they require a special kind of care to work through, was a real eye-opener for me.
Well, there's a dynamic that I wanted to ask you about, because basically, like, your comments in class were always just were outstanding, and I'm interested in your perspective. So there's a dynamic that's going on that I'm hearing about more and more, where traditionally, as family businesses get more complex as they go through generations, generally, that in the past, if there was a board for that family business, the nuclear family would typically have the same opinions, at least outwardly, about how that business should be run or managed from the board level. And that family stood together when they were participating in the business. And other families, other relatives, their families would also stand together and kind of vote accordingly. But I am hearing that more and more the similarities are closer or between generations rather than the nuclear family. So it's almost like a block of the younger generation that has views on how the business should be operated, and then a block of the older generation, and that is creating some disruption that hasn't occurred in the past. But I thought, so from a generational standpoint, do you have some ideas about what's going on there? Or at business school, were you able to think about those generational differences, and any thoughts on what's going on, what people coming out of MBA school care about, and how that might be different than more senior generations? Not suggesting right or wrong here, but I'm interested in that dynamic.
Well, I think when you look at it in family business, I think first we want to think about it in a broader context outside of just family, where a big trend of businesses in general is a increased focus, not just on ESG, on environmental, social, and governance topics, but on what does it mean to be a shareholder, really, versus that stakeholder argument. We see that a lot at the highest levels of business, where, you know, what it really is now, the stakeholder, the employee, the local community, and businesses have varying views, or business leaders have varying views. But I think we're seeing that as somewhat of a generational gap, where that idea of the stakeholder was really important for a lot of my classmates, and we had a lot of discussions around what the role of business is for, you know, just enriching the shareholder versus all stakeholders involved in the business. And when you see that dynamic play out specifically within a family business, that's where I think you start to see that generational block voting or block agreement, if you will, where the older generation of a family might see the goal of the business being, even if it's not enriching the shareholder, that generation has over time come to some accord of, here is what the goal of our business is, here's our purpose, which was something we talked about a lot in the family business class. And where those differences come through are probably sourced from the younger generation not necessarily disapproving of the business or disapproving of any single direct action, but really more on that broader purpose topic. What are we really trying to do from this business? What will we look back on and say we were successful if we did this? And I think that is where you're starting to see a little bit of a divide and a little bit of some conversation around how does purpose need to adapt moving forward across these businesses. And I think the result is going to be something really healthy, where even if the purpose doesn't change explicitly, a younger generation can get a better understanding of how businesses function, and an older generation can get a better understanding of how younger people see the role of business, which I think can only make a business more successful. Because by understanding a younger generation, in many cases, you're better understanding your customer too.
I think you're going to do great in your current work, because just like you've talked about communication, and then just even being able to identify that shareholder versus stakeholder mindset is helpful for communication. And I think you're totally all right. Like, that's just brought up and discussed more, it can often help alleviate some abrasiveness within business meetings and family dynamics. So one other thing that's very different, I think, is the media. And so younger generations are absorbing information differently than the senior generations. I'm constantly kind of dismayed by the lack of representations of people like your age on networks, and how that's something that we need to rectify. But is it one of your views maybe that, like, where are you getting your media, maybe I should say, like, what do you read, how are you keeping up with what's going on in the world? So
this is such a interesting topic, because I think when you look at media 50 years ago, which was dominated by print, shifting towards TV media, and then TV media really stepped into the limelight, and now all forms of media have had to adopt with the internet age. And I think the way I consume media right now, I mean, I could give you an answer right now. You know, I read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times on my phone, or whatever the answer might be. But I am 100% certain that the way I consume media, the way I get news right now, will not be the way I get news in 10 years. I think we are still trying to figure that out. And when you look at, again, a younger generation who hasn't grown up spending their entire life with one form of media, and they remain flexible to figuring out what is their source of news, I think there's a lot of dynamism going on in that industry. And we are so far from figuring out how media is actually going to be consumed into the long-term future that I really don't have a good answer for that. Again, I have the internet. I don't have TV. I'll say I'm a cord cutter. I've never had cable internet, cable TV. I've always had internet, but never had TV in anywhere I've lived. So I think that is such a dynamic place. And when you talk about representation specifically, I think there is this idea that the millennials or the younger generations are an increasing presence in the market and have an increasing role to play in shaping business and media culture. But I think because of that maybe lack of loyalty to a specific news or media source, that it's harder to create a really strong, broad, diverse representation within that media group, because we're not necessarily drawn to any one thing. You know, if you think 20 years ago, if you wanted to be in news media, you gravitated towards TV, and that's kind of it. Maybe there was also some newspaper going on behind you. But now the options, you could be a podcaster, you could write a blog, you can do so many different things that I think it's hard to attract talent in a single direction.
Yeah, it's really interesting too how trends can come from above, like, and traditionally maybe that's how they happen, but they can also come from below, like more social media gives people the ability to express themselves in a way they hadn't before, and that can influence what's going on with the younger generation in a way that probably makes senior generations are potentially a little uncomfortable. And it's interesting that the dynamic is still playing out kind of live, especially with the election coming up.
I think, David, you and your team at the Family Enterprise Center, if you think about media specifically today in a world changed by coronavirus, where people are spending so much more time at home and consuming media so much more, I think it has created this, across generations, this increased reliance on any sort of trusted institution for news or content or media, whether that is your university, your alma mater, or a specific center at the university. I think that is kind of the classic role of the university, is to provide research and insight in a novel and new way. And I think the Family Enterprise Center has really done a great job of being communicative with the family businesses who subscribe to news from the Family Enterprise Center. But even beyond that, whether it's not just a news source, but any sort of trusted institution, your local government, it could be your financial institution, it could be a governmental agency that you subscribe to, it can be a science publication, whatever it might be. I think there is this increased reliance of people turning to trusted institutions for input and advice and news, because people just have so much more capacity and time to absorb that media while they're sitting at home.
That's good to hear. It'd be nice to have some good examples of people using the stature institutional reputation and not abusing it. You know, that's what I look for too when I'm out surfing for information. And it's sometimes tough to find, but I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. And I hope that I can periodically check in with you and see how things are going as you continue to grow in your career.
Thank you, David. I appreciate that. And I hope to stay in touch too, and look forward to working with the Family Enterprise Center going forward.
Have a great week.
Thank you.